Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very confusing. The pyramids. Those massive stone triangles in the desert that make everyone say, no way humans built that, which is honestly kind of rude to ancient Egypt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Of all the mysteries humanity has cooked up over the centuries, disappearing civilizations, ancient curses, where did I put my keys? Nothing has lingered in the public imagination quite like the pyramids. These colossal, desert-dominating triangles of limestone have been sitting there for over 4,000 years, minding their own business. And yet modern people still look at them and say, nope. Humans didn't do that. Impossible. Bring me the aliens. It's a question that refuses to die, because the pyramids themselves refuse to be subtle. They are unapologetically gigantic. They are mathematically precise. They are older than your entire family tree, your country, your language, and possibly your sense of fashion. They radiate the energy of something that should not be possible, like a cat obeying instructions or a grocery cart with all four wheels functioning. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and look up. The thing is so huge it makes skyscrapers insecure. And unlike modern skyscrapers, it was not built using computer models, cranes, or a construction crew wearing reflective vests and arguing about lunch breaks. It was built with stone tools, sweat, organization, and a level of ancient stubbornness that deserves a global award. And this is precisely why the big question sticks around. How did ancient Egyptians build something this massive without modern technology? It haunts people. It taunts people. It lurks in documentaries narrated by men with dramatic voices who refuse to speak at a normal volume. Every year, someone somewhere releases a new theory. Ramps, spirals, water flotation, giants, sound levitation, or the ever-popular explanation. Something forgotten civilization. Because apparently it is easier for some people to believe in an ancient, secret, hyper-advanced society that vanished without a trace than to accept that Egyptians were just good at their jobs. But here's the thing. The pyramids weren't miracles, and they weren't cosmic mysteries. They were engineering, brilliant, organized, relentless engineering, powered by tens of thousands of skilled workers who probably just wanted their wages, their bread rations, and a day off that never came. The pyramids have become symbols of mystery, but to the people who built them, they were construction projects. Massive ones, yes. Difficult ones, definitely. But not magical. Just, boss wants a giant stone triangle, so we're making a giant stone triangle. So the real question is not whether humans built the pyramids. It's how ancient Egyptians pulled off one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. One perfectly placed block at a time. Let's clear up the biggest historical misconception right away. The pyramids were not built by enslaved people being whipped under the desert sun by a villainous overseer who looked suspiciously like he belonged in a badly researched Hollywood movie. That version of history survives only because filmmakers love dramatic scenery and because someone, somewhere, once said, "This is close enough," and thousands of people just went along with it. The truth is far more surprising, and honestly, much more wholesome. The pyramids were built by paid Egyptian workers. Yes, paid. As in wages, food rations, housing, time off, medical care, and work crews with supervisors who actually wrote performance reports on pottery shards. It was less slavery and more massive national construction project, run by people who were both committed and slightly terrified of disappointing the pharaoh. These workers weren't random citizens dragged off the street. They were specialists, quarrymen, engineers, architects, toolmakers, bakers, brewers, rope makers, and yes, even professional stone haulers with thighs strong enough to crush a chariot. Many came from farming families. The Nile's flood season made farming impossible for part of the year, so instead of sitting at home complaining about the weather, like modern people, they joined rotating labour teams called gangs. Each gang had names like the Friends of Khufu, which is adorable, until you remember the friend in question was building a pyramid the size of a small mountain. Archaeologists also discovered worker villages near the pyramids, entire neighbourhoods with bakeries, barracks, breweries, kitchens and medical facilities. There were even cemeteries for workers who died during the project, buried with honours. No one builds a cemetery for enslaved labourers. They build one for people they respect. And let's not forget the beer. Workers received rations of bread, onions and enough beer per day to keep morale high and mild dehydration at bay. This wasn't cheap beer either. It was ancient Egypt's version of an energy drink. Thick, nutritious, and strong enough to make you believe you could actually move a 50-ton stone block. Were conditions easy? Absolutely not. Imagine working construction in a desert wearing linen, hauling limestone under a sun that could melt your hopes. But these weren't disposable labourers. They were skilled, valued, and essential workers in the largest building project on Earth. So no, the pyramids weren't built by slaves. They were built by teams of hard-working Egyptians, who probably wondered every day why the pharaoh couldn't have chosen a smaller tomb. If you picture ancient Egyptian architects as men in linen skirts, casually doodling triangle shapes in the sand until something pyramid-ish emerges, prepare to have your worldview professionally adjusted. The people who designed the pyramids were not guessing. They were not improvising. They were not vibing their way to world wonders. They were mathematical assassins. These planners, the scribes, surveyors, architects and overseers, were the elite nerd squad of ancient Egypt. Forget Hogwarts. This was Papyri Warts, where students studied geometry, measurements, astronomy, logistics, and how to keep 2,000 workers from wandering off to take a nap in the shade. The Egyptians did not use advanced calculators or pocket lasers. They used ropes, shadows, poles, and more geometry than your high school teacher ever hoped you'd remember. Their ropes had knots spaced at precise intervals to measure distances, angles, and lay out grids. Meanwhile, your rope at home is tangled, embarrassing, and probably being used as a clothesline. Aligning the Great Pyramid alone required an almost disrespectful level of precision. We're talking alignment to the cardinal directions so accurate that modern surveyors get nervous. Meanwhile, the Egyptians achieved this with nothing but stargazing and sheer confidence. They tracked the movement of circumpolar stars, determined true north through celestial observations, and then said, "Yes, this is fine," as if they hadn't just performed divine-level mathematics with a stick. The planners also solved the small issue of building something huge that wouldn't collapse. They used slope ratios, load distribution, internal chambers, relieving blocks, and the basic architectural principle of, if this falls down, the pharaoh will be extremely unhappy, so let's not do that. They also mapped out worker housing, water distribution, food supply, tool management, stone logistics, and ramp construction. Imagine designing a city, a supply chain, a monument, and a very large triangle all at once, then being told you must also finish it before the pharaoh finishes his reign and starts haunting you for being late. Even the placement of the pyramids was intentional. They built on bedrock for stability, near the Nile for transportation, and close to quarries to avoid dragging limestone from the opposite side of the planet. Every decision was calculated, deliberate, and deeply not aligned with the popular idea that they just stacked rocks. These were not random desert triangles. They were planned with brilliance, discipline, and just enough mathematical charisma to survive thousands of years. The pyramids aren't mysteries of construction. They're monuments to ancient Egypt's nerds. And those nerds were unstoppable. If you want to understand how the pyramids were built, you must begin where ancient Egyptian dreams went to die. The quarries. Because before a single block ever touched a ramp, before any engineer with suspiciously good geometry skills drew a single perfect angle, somebody had to cut tens of thousands of stones out of solid bedrock. And trust me, this was not the glamorous part of pyramid construction. This was the welcome to the Bronze Age, here is your hammer, go cry in the heat part. Most of the limestone for the Great Pyramid came from a quarry that was, inconveniently, right next to the pyramid site. This was considered lucky. which tells you everything you need to know about ancient construction standards. But even with that short distance, the real challenge was carving gigantic blocks out of rock, using none of the tools humans desperately want them to have. No iron saws, no power tools, no divine laser cutters from the star Sirius, just copper chisels, stone hammers, and the sheer determination of thousands of workers who were probably trying not to think too hard about the rest of their workday. Egyptian quarrying sounded simple in theory. Chisel lines, pound wedges, crack stone, remove block. Hope your supervisor doesn't say, actually, we need 50 more by noon. In reality, it was dusty, loud, sweaty, and involved so much sand that some workers probably still had grains in their socks when they reached the afterlife. Copper chisels dulled constantly, so blacksmiths were on standby like overworked pit crews at an ancient NASCAR event. The workers would return every hour with tools blunted by stone harder than their will to live. The blacksmith reheated, reshaped, hammered, handed it back, and watched the cycle repeat. The ancient economy ran on bread, beer, and an unreasonable faith in soft metal. For harder stones, like the granite used for the inner chambers, workers went to Aswan, miles upriver. This is where Egyptian patience reached deity level. They used dolerite pounders, which were basically dense, angry rocks, to crush granite into submission. Imagine beating a countertop with another countertop until one of them gives up. That was the job. Once cut, blocks had to be hauled out of the quarry along prepared tracks. Teams dragged them inch by inch, overseen by men with sticks and enthusiasm, but mostly sticks. The quarries weren't just the beginning of the pyramid, they were the crucible, the place where stone, sweat, and supreme stubbornness fused into the raw material of eternity. Moving multi-ton limestone blocks across the desert sounds like the kind of task that would require heavy machinery, an engineering degree, and at least 3 emotional support beverages. But ancient Egyptians managed it without cranes, trucks, hydraulics, forklifts, or the modern invention known as calling someone else to do it. Instead, they relied on what every great civilization secretly runs on: clever engineering, teamwork, and a staggering amount of stubbornness. Let's start with the basics. The blocks did not get rolled on giant wooden logs, contrary to every schoolbook illustration ever. Why? Because Egypt had about 7 trees total, all of which were busy being sacred, royal, or decorative. The idea of wasting precious wood on rolling stones the size of bedrooms was about as likely as Pharaoh issuing free dental care. So the Egyptians used sledges, giant wooden sleds onto which the stone blocks were loaded. Workers pulled them using thick ropes, forming long, coordinated teams. And by coordinated, I mean dozens of men shouting at each other while attempting to move something heavier than their collective hopes and dreams. But the trick wasn't the pulling, it was the sand. Dry sand is terrible for dragging heavy objects. Your sledge sinks, friction skyrockets, and suddenly everything is terrible and everyone wants to go home. So the Egyptians did something genius. They watered the sand. Yes, real science. When you sprinkle water onto loose sand, the grains clump together, reducing friction dramatically. Suddenly, the sledge glides across the surface like a smooth ancient cheat code. This wasn't speculation. It's depicted in actual paintings. One worker is always shown pouring water in front of the sledge, looking like he's doing the ancient equivalent of maintenance, while everyone else does the pulling. For longer distances, they used river barges. Massive stone blocks were floated up or down the Nile on wooden boats so sturdy they might as well have signed sponsorship deals. Teams loaded stones at quarry docks, sailed them to nearby ramps, and unloaded them via controlled chaos. Then came the desert hauling that required rhythmic pulling, coordinated chanting, and enough rope tension to make a modern safety inspector spontaneously combust. At no point did Egyptians shrug and say, "This is too hard, let's quit." Instead, they refined the process over generations, turning stone transport into a national sport. Not for glory, not for fun, but because they had pyramids to build and absolutely no interest in disappointing a pharaoh who believed his afterlife depended on punctual construction. If you've ever climbed a stairmaster at the gym and thought, wow, this is torture, allow me to introduce you to the ancient Egyptians. The civilization that created the first and greatest stairmaster system in human history. Except instead of climbing stairs for fitness, they climbed ramps for massive stone-moving doom. And instead of a fan blowing in their face, they had a foreman yelling, "Faster!" When people imagine pyramid construction, they picture ropes, sweat, maybe 100 men pulling a block. But what they should be imagining is ramps. Ramps everywhere. Ramps that stretched across the desert like ancient Egyptian traffic jams. Ramps that went straight, sideways, zigzagging, spiralling, and occasionally causing architects to stare at their own sketches like, this is fine, this is definitely fine. Why ramps? Because ancient Egyptians understood one simple truth. It's easier to drag a stone up a slope than float it into the sky using alien Wi-Fi. There were a few main ramp types, and each one was its own flavour of misery. The straight ramp, the original classic. A long, thick, brutally steep ramp made of mud brick, limestone chippings and crushed hopes. This ramp ran directly up one side of the pyramid. It worked well at the beginning, until the pyramid got taller and the ramp had to grow so long it could theoretically reach another city. Also, it blocked the face of the pyramid, which architects hated, a prehistoric version of "you're ruining the aesthetic." The zigzag ramp. Like someone looked at the straight ramp, shrugged, and said, what if the workers needed more steps? This ramp snaked back and forth up the pyramid sides, turning the job of dragging stone into a cardio workout so intense it should have come with complementary electrolytes. The spiral ramp, for the architect who wanted the workers to suffer, but in a more creative way. This ramp wrapped around the pyramid as it rose, like a giant sandstone unicorn horn. Great for elevation, terrible for visibility. Block haulers constantly bumped into each other like confused mountain goats. And the real genius? They kept adjusting the ramps as the pyramid grew. Build higher, extend the ramp. Build higher, adjust again. Workers didn't just build the pyramid, they built the thing that allowed them to build the pyramid. It was construction inside construction. A nightmare inside a bigger nightmare. But here's the thing. The ramps worked. Efficient. Powerful. Simple. Brutal. And all without treadmills, lifting belts, or a single gym membership. If you picture the pyramid workforce as a chaotic mob of half-starved slaves, collapsing in the sun, while an overseer screams, "Faster!" Congratulations, you've watched too many Hollywood movies. Reality was far more impressive, and honestly, more entertaining. The pyramid workforce was organised chaos, emphasis on organised, with just a light drizzle of chaos for flavour. First, the workers weren't slaves. They were paid labourers, skilled craftsmen, seasonal workers, and farmers picking up side gigs during Nile flooding season. Think of it like ancient Egypt's version of construction workers, unionised farmers and part-time dads who got bored sitting at home. They even lived in designated workers' towns with bakeries, breweries, clinics and barracks. Yes, clinics. Because you cannot build a literal mountain of stone without someone smashing a finger every 14 minutes. These workers were divided into teams called gangs, each proudly naming themselves things like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunk but Determined Crew. Names that sound suspiciously like modern intramural sports teams. Every gang had its own hierarchy, supervisors, team leads, and scribes tracking who did what. Imagine someone spending 8 hours a day writing, Amenhotep moved 3 blocks, Kenru moved 2 blocks and then complained about his back. They had cooks preparing tens of thousands of loaves of bread per day, brewers making vats of beer, and butchers handling cattle so regularly that the butcher's area looked like a Bronze Age supermarket without refrigeration. Beer, by the way, was part of the workers' daily ration, hydration plus morale. The ancient Egyptians basically invented the concept of drink on the job. Workers came in different tiers. You had skilled stonecutters, the elite specialists, haulers, the muscle who dragged blocks with ropes, riggers, who coordinated lifts and pulls, water carriers, whose job was hydrating literally everyone and smoothing sand for sledges, and finally, the supervisors, whose job was pointing dramatically and saying, "Lift it, no, higher." Despite the scale, the system functioned astonishingly well. Workers rotated shifts, teams competed for efficiency, injuries were treated. They had medical records showing healed bones and long-term care. This was not a disposable workforce. This was a national treasure of manpower, logistics, and questionable ancient motivational speeches. Was it exhausting? Absolutely. Was it chaotic? Of course. But it was organized chaos, the kind that builds a monument so massive people thousands of years later insist it must have been aliens. The workers didn't just build pyramids. They built one of history's greatest case studies in teamwork. You don't pull multi-ton limestone blocks across the desert on an empty stomach. The ancient Egyptians understood this deeply, perhaps too deeply, because the pyramid builders were fueled by a diet that can only be described as carbs, more carbs, onions, and enough beer to stun a camel. Let's start with bread, the backbone of the ancient Egyptian food pyramid, which ironically powered the actual pyramids. Workers received rations of thick, heavy loaves that were basically ancient protein bars, if protein bars were made of wheat, grit, and enough calories to keep a human dragging stones from sunrise to sunset. This bread wasn't soft or fluffy. It was durable, indestructible. Some archaeologists have found bread so hard it could probably become a construction material. Then we have onions. Mountains of onions. Entire fields dedicated to fueling workers with this pungent miracle bulb. Why onions? Because they were cheap, grown everywhere, and, in the Egyptian worldview, full of spiritual protection. And also because onions are dense in calories and electrolytes, turning each worker into a surprisingly efficient, if extremely fragrant, labour machine. Next up, dried fish. Salty, chewy, and stored in quantities that suggest the Nile was providing an all-you-can-eat buffet. This fish delivered protein for muscle repair, and considering these workers were essentially human forklifts, muscle repair was not optional. Some modern reconstructions estimate that the average pyramid labourer burned over 4,000 calories a day. The fish didn't taste great, but it kept people alive long enough to keep pulling. And then we reach the star of the menu, the liquid MVP, the fuel that made everything possible, beer. Not modern, crisp, refreshing beer. No. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, bready, and nutritious, more like a drinkable loaf than a beverage, and workers consumed an estimated 4 litres per person per day. Hydration? Yes. Nutrition? Definitely. Motivation? Questionable, but probably yes. Look, we can't prove the pyramids were built by tipsy workers, but we can't rule it out either. Imagine hauling a stone block the size of a small car after your 3rd litre of breakfast beer. Suddenly it makes sense why ancient Egyptians depicted their gods with animal heads. After enough ancient beer, everything probably looked like that. Despite the jokes, this diet was carefully engineered. High calories, high carbs, enough salts to survive the heat, and constant liquid intake. It was the world's first state-sponsored mass catering program, a prehistoric cafeteria designed to keep thousands of workers constructing the most iconic stone structures on Earth. Bread, onions, fish, and beer. Not glamorous, not elegant, but undeniably effective. Here's where the pyramids go from impressive engineering project to, okay, now you're just showing off. Because the Great Pyramid isn't just big, it isn't just old, it is insanely precise. So precise that even modern engineers sometimes stare at it like it just insulted their degree. Let's start with the alignment. The Great Pyramid is oriented to true north with an accuracy so absurd that you'd think the builders had access to a satellite, a laser, and a very patient surveyor. But no, they had sticks, string, and the sky. And yet they aligned the entire structure within a fraction of a degree of the planet's actual north-south axis. Today, we have compasses, GPS, and apps, that tell you which direction to face while cooking noodles. They had the sun and an attitude of close enough. Except their close turned out to be mathematically ridiculous. Then there's the levelling. The base of the Great Pyramid sits on a platform so perfectly flat that it makes modern construction sites look like someone eyeballed everything after lunch. Across a surface the size of several football fields, the entire base varies in height by less than the width of your thumb. Not bad for people without bulldozers, lasers, or the ability to yell, "We're off level," while waving a digital level around. And the sides? Oh, the sides. Each one is almost exactly the same length. We're talking variations in millimeters. Millimeters. This is the kind of precision you expect from a Swiss watchmaker, not a civilization that carved stone with copper chisels and used geometry taught by priests who also performed embalming on weekends. How did they do it? Very carefully, painstakingly, with a level of teamwork and patience that absolutely no modern group project possesses. They used ropes, grids, plumb bobs, water trenches, the movement of the stars, and good old-fashioned stubbornness. When something wasn't right, they fixed it. When a block didn't align, they adjusted it. No shortcuts. No good enough. No, we'll fix it in post-production. And perhaps the funniest part, none of this was done for tourists, future archaeologists, or the approval of conspiracy theorists. They weren't trying to impress us. They built with this level of precision because their religion demanded perfection, and because no one wanted to be the guy responsible for the slightly crooked pyramid. So yes, the Great Pyramid's precision seems impossible, but the builders weren't aiming for possible. They were aiming for eternal, and they hit the mark. Moving the stone blocks to the pyramid was impressive, but placing them? That was where ancient Egyptian engineering truly said, "All right, everyone, let's get ridiculous." Once the stones arrived at the construction site, scraped across desert sledges, dragged by teams of workers, occasionally yelled at by supervisors who took their job way too seriously, the next challenge began. Lifting multi-ton blocks up an ever-growing staircase of limestone. And remember, no pulleys, no cranes, no forklifts driven by a guy named Dave, just levers, teamwork, and a level of determination fueled largely by beer and spite. The first tool in their arsenal, the lever. A simple wooden beam wedged under the edge of a block and pulled downward to lift it upward. The same principle used today for opening stubborn jars, flipping tables dramatically, or removing something you regret from under the fridge. Workers wedged the lever under the stone, lifted it a few centimetres, slid small stones underneath, then repeated the process. Lift, wedge, the ancient equivalent of someone tapping snooze repeatedly, except much heavier and without the promise of sleep. Next came the sledges, used not only for horizontal dragging, but also for short, controlled vertical adjustments. Teams positioned the block at the edge of the ramp or pyramid layer, then relied on coordinated pulling, guiding ropes, and a spiritual amount of grunting. Supervisors stood nearby, offering helpful commentary like, "Pull harder," "No, harder," and "Are you even trying?" The stones didn't magically click into position. They were coaxed like stubborn cats. Each block was adjusted with smaller stones acting as temporary supports, nudged gently with wooden mallets, and aligned with string grids stretched across the entire pyramid structure. And by string grids, we mean one worker holding a rope and squinting intensely while insisting he was perfectly straight. The most astonishing part? These blocks fit together with such tight precision that not even a knife blade can slip between them today. That means every time a block was slightly crooked, a team of exhausted workers had to adjust it, again and again, until the overseer said, "Yes, that'll do," or gave up pretending he could tell the difference. And as the pyramid grew taller, so did the difficulty. Workers hauled stones up ramps, lifted them into place, and adjusted them under brutal sun, swirling dust, and desert heat that absolutely did not care for their well-being. The fact that this process was repeated millions of times is the real miracle. Not aliens, not lost super technology, Just pure human strength, geometry, and the unwavering ancient Egyptian commitment to saying, higher. If the outside of the pyramids is impressive, the inside is where ancient Egyptian architects basically leaned over to the future and whispered, good luck figuring this out. Because while most people imagine pyramids as giant stone triangles with nothing going on inside, the truth is the opposite. They are stuffed with corridors, chambers, shafts, hidden passageways, and architectural decisions that scream, we're geniuses, but also slightly dramatic. Let's start with the King's Chamber, a room built entirely out of massive granite blocks quarried from Aswan, sitting more than 500 miles away. Each granite beam weighs between 50 and 80 tons, which is roughly the size of a small whale or a large argument. And somehow, Egyptians hauled them across the country, up ramps, and into the centre of the pyramid without cranes, forklifts, or a group chat labelled Granite Squad. How did they do it? With ramps, platforms, and an attitude of relentless optimism. They likely created angled ramps that spiralled or zigzagged upward inside the structure. These ramps allowed workers to drag the beams horizontally rather than lifting them vertically, which is good, because lifting an 80-ton block straight up is the kind of thing that makes engineers lie down and rethink their life choices. Once inside the chamber area, the real magic happened. Using levers, rollers, sledges, and a whole lot of shouting, teams manoeuvred each granite block into place with millimetre-level precision. No hydraulics, no steel. Just physics, determination, and the ancient Egyptian version of co-worker pressure. But the crowning achievement, the thing that makes modern engineers mutter, okay, that's actually insane, is the system of relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. These stacked rooms, separated by massive stone beams, redistributed the weight of the pyramid so the chamber wouldn't collapse under the millions of tons of stone above it. It's basically an ancient shock absorber system, or the world's first "this building shall not crush the pharaoh" insurance policy. The brilliance is that the Egyptians didn't just build a chamber, they built a chamber with layers of architectural armour. Each relieving chamber absorbed stress, diverted pressure, and kept the ceiling from doing the one thing a ceiling should never do: fall. So yes, ancient Egyptians mastered structural load distribution long before anyone walked into an engineering lecture and heard the phrase compressive stress. These people didn't just build monuments, they built puzzles that modern experts still argue about. And the best part, they made it look easy. If you imagine pyramid builders living in tents, chewing on sand, and collapsing in the desert, while someone with eyeliner shouts orders, please toss that image directly into the Nile. The actual daily life around the Giza construction area looked more like a bustling industrial town. Ancient, dusty, slightly chaotic, but surprisingly well managed. Workers didn't live in the middle of nowhere. They lived in a purpose-built workers' village, complete with straight streets, bakeries, breweries, kitchens, barracks, storage houses, and even neighbourhoods. It was the Bronze Age version of a company town, just with more sun and fewer vacation days. The bakeries alone were producing bread on an industrial scale. We're talking mountains of dough. Archaeologists found massive communal ovens so blackened from use, they looked like they'd been personally scorched by Ra himself. And the bread wasn't the dainty artisan loaf you see on Instagram. This was dense, brick-like, calorie bomb bread designed to fuel a human engine dragging multi-ton stones uphill. And the beer? Let's just say, OSHA would have had concerns. Workers drank around 4 litres of beer per day, which is absolutely a health hazard in the modern world, but was considered hydration with benefits in ancient Egypt. The beer was thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic. The perfect combination for a civilization that built wonders and probably had incredible tolerance. The workers' village also had butcheries, where cattle, sheep, and goats were processed to feed the massive workforce. Ancient Egyptians weren't starving on the job. They were eating meat, onions, fish, bread, and enough carbs to power the entire Philadelphia Eagles' offensive line. And then there's the medical care. Yes, real medical care. Archaeologists found skeletons with bone fractures that healed perfectly straight, which means someone at the site was basically acting as an ancient orthopedic surgeon. People with broken legs and arms weren't thrown aside. They were treated, rested, and returned to work once healed, which is more than certain modern employers can claim. The village wasn't just efficient, it was social. Workers ate together, slept in shared quarters, joked, argued, exchanged gossip, and almost certainly complained about supervisors, just like every work site in human history. The walls even have graffiti, workers carving team names like the Friends of Khufu, which sounds less like a labour crew and more like an ancient bowling league. Daily life wasn't glamorous, but it wasn't miserable either. It was organised, structured, human, and it powered the greatest construction project the world has ever seen. If you came here expecting ancient Egyptians to whip out laser cutters, diamond saws, or some mysterious alien toolkit shaped like a glowing USB stick, I regret to inform you. Their tools were hilariously simple. So simple, in fact, that if you handed them to a modern construction worker, he would stare at you, stare at the tool, and then file an HR complaint. But here's the twist. The Egyptians didn't need advanced technology. Their brilliance came not from what they used, but how they used it. Their toolkit included copper chisels, wooden mallets, stone pounders, wooden sledges, and dolerite balls, which, in case you're not familiar with ancient geology, are basically fist-sized cannonballs made of a rock tougher than a bad-tempered camel. These dolerite pounders were used to bash limestone blocks into shape. Not carve, not shave, bash. Full force, day after day, until the stone surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. Copper chisels were softer than the stone they were hitting, meaning they had to be constantly re-sharpened. Imagine being a pyramid worker, chiseling for 10 minutes, and then walking all the way back to the blacksmith like, "Hey, yeah? It's dull again." And the blacksmith sighs, because he has sharpened that exact chisel approximately 19,000 times this month. Wooden mallets were used for striking the chisels. Simple, effective, and perfect for building pyramids and venting workplace frustration. Every mallet swing doubled as therapy. Every chisel strike whispered, "This pharaoh better appreciate this." Then we have the stone pounders. These were used by the more enthusiastic workers. Their job? Smash. Just smash. Smash the limestone blocks until they achieved the perfect shape. Archaeologists have found piles of shattered dolerite balls, meaning some workers really went for it. The ancient equivalent of someone hitting the gym and deciding every day is arm day. But the true genius wasn't the tool itself. It was the method. Egyptians used grids, red ochre guidelines, plumb lines made from string, and levels based on water trenches. With nothing but simple geometry, good eyesight, and a terrifying amount of patience, they achieved accuracy today's contractors would blame on the machine doing most of the work. Their tools were humble. Their techniques were elegant. Their craftsmanship was legendary. They didn't need alien tech. They had skill, discipline, and the collective determination to complete the pharaoh's enormous cosmic flex. At some point in this story, a very reasonable question pops into the mind. Why? Why build something this big? Why drag millions of stone blocks across blistering desert heat? Why pour decades of national effort into a triangular mountain that does not, in fact, have a gift shop? Well, ancient Egypt had several answers, and depending on which one you focus on, the pyramids start to look either spiritual, political, or like the world's earliest recorded case of "my dynasty is bigger than your dynasty." First, religion. The ancient Egyptian afterlife was not a casual concept. It was a full-time, high-budget production, and the pharaoh was the star of the show. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a resurrection machine, a giant stone launch pad meant to shoot the king's soul upward toward the heavens, or at least give it a slope to climb. The shape itself symbolized the rays of the sun, guiding the pharaoh's spirit to join the gods. Think of it as spiritual infrastructure. Second, politics. You must remember, pharaohs were not elected officials. They were absolute rulers with unlimited ambition and a sincere fear of being forgotten. A pyramid was not just a building, it was a message. It said, "My kingship is eternal. My power is unmatched. Please stop plotting against me. I literally built a mountain. Constructing a pyramid announced to rival elites, citizens, and neighbouring states that the pharaoh had total control over labour, resources, logistics, and geology. It was the ancient equivalent of a political billboard, except instead of being 20 feet tall, it was 480 feet tall and visible from orbit. Third, legacy and flexing. Let's be honest, pharaohs liked showing off. If you ruled a superpower with divine status and a god complex, wouldn't you commission something absurdly large? The Great Pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement piece. A monument that said, "Look on my works, ye mighty," and maybe bring a measuring tape, because these dimensions are insane. Building colossal pyramids also unified the nation. Workers were fed, housed, paid, and cared for. Farmers had employment during the Nile flood season. Industries boomed to supply the construction. The pyramid project wasn't just a tomb. It was a national economic stimulus package disguised as a giant stone triangle. In short, pyramids were religion, politics, legacy, engineering, and the ultimate desert flex. And somehow, thousands of years later, the message still stands, literally. In medieval Europe, the open road was less a pathway between towns and more a hunting ground where danger followed every step. Travellers feared the shadowed woods not because of wild animals, though wolves and boars existed, but because of something far worse, men who behaved exactly like predators. Highwaymen earned the chilling nickname "wolves of the road" for a reason. They operated with patience, strategy, and a ruthless understanding of human fear. Every pilgrim bound for a holy shrine, every merchant hauling goods, every messenger carrying sealed letters, knew that beyond the city walls, law and civilization grew thin. And where the law thinned, the hunters waited. Medieval authorities simply couldn't control the territory. Patrols were scarce, roads were poorly maintained, and forests were thick enough to swallow entire gangs. Bandits knew the landscape better than soldiers. They mapped ambush points, narrow crossings where a wagon couldn't turn, sharp bends where a rider's sight disappeared, bridges where the sound of hooves covered the rustling of blades, and old Roman roads cracked with overgrowth. Travellers might walk for hours without encountering another soul, except the one who wanted their purse. What separated these highwaymen from ordinary thieves wasn't just their violence, but their organisation. Some operated alone, but the most feared groups worked in coordinated packs, communicating with whistles or bird calls. Scouts perched in tree branches, watching dust clouds rise from approaching caravans. Others disguised themselves as friendly wanderers, blending among pilgrims just long enough to identify who carried money, relics, silk, spices, or letters worth ransoming. When the strike came, it was fast and decisive. A fallen tree blocked the path. A rope snapped tight around a horse's legs. A dagger pressed into a throat. The message was always the same: comply or die unseen. Even nobles weren't safe. Many lords travelled with guards, but bandits had spies in taverns who listened for gossip about wealthy caravans leaving at dawn. Some gangs even had informants inside monasteries and markets who traded information for a cut of the loot. If a noble carried coin or fine fabrics, the highwayman would know before the noble even saddled his horse. In this world, fear ruled the roads, and the wolves of the road thrived because they understood one fundamental truth. In medieval Europe, the journey itself was often more dangerous than the destination. If medieval travellers feared anything more than the highwaymen themselves, it was the terrain that helped them. Europe's geography was an accomplice to banditry. Dense forests, mountain passes, marshlands, and abandoned Roman roads created natural choke points where a traveller's fate could be sealed in seconds. And the bandits knew every inch of it. They weren't simply robbers. They were masters of terrain warfare. Forests were the worst of all. In places like the Black Forest, Sherwood, or the Carpathian foothills, visibility collapsed into a claustrophobic tunnel of branches and shadows. Travellers described hearing twigs snapping behind them, leaves crunching softly, and the unsettling feeling that they were being watched. and they usually were. Bandits perched in trees like sentinels, studying the gait of horses and the weight of wagons. From up high, they could see purses bulging, hear gossip about destinations, and decide whether the travellers were worth the risk. Mountain passes were no safer. In the Alps, the Pyrenees and the Balkans, thieves used elevation to their advantage. A single rock slide, often intentionally triggered, could trap an entire caravan between vertical cliffs. With nowhere to run, the victims faced a brutal truth. The highwaymen were above them, aiming arrows or rolling weighted stones. Even a small gang of 4 or 5 men could freeze a group of 20 in place through sheer positional superiority. Then there were the forgotten Roman roads, once symbols of imperial order, now crumbling corridors of danger. Over time, weeds, vines and roots split the stones, turning the paths into uneven hazards. But the old roadbeds still forced travellers into predictable routes. Bandits loved these. A fallen milestone became cover. An overgrown archway became a perfect hiding spot. The wilderness had swallowed the empire, but bandits had learned to thrive in the ruins of that swallowed world. The danger wasn't always a sudden attack. Sometimes it was a slow tightening of the noose. Travellers would notice unnatural quiet. No birdsong, no distant voices. Then they'd spot something odd. A broken wagon abandoned in the middle of the road, or a leather purse left on a stump as bait. Some cautious travellers turned back immediately. Others hesitated too long. That hesitation was all the bandits needed. In these landscapes, nature didn't merely hide the highwaymen, it empowered them. The environment itself became a weapon, turning entire regions of medieval Europe into ambush country, where the line between a safe journey and a fatal mistake was terrifyingly thin. While lone highwaymen occasionally lurked along medieval roads, the true terror came from organised gangs, groups bound not by loyalty or honour, but by survival, greed, and necessity. These were brotherhoods formed in the shadows, where each member understood one rule above all: trust no one, except the man whose blade protects your back. In a world where kings relied on armoured knights, bandit gangs created their own version of hierarchy, discipline, and brutal efficiency. Most gangs were composed of desperate men, runaway serfs fleeing impossible taxes, failed mercenaries abandoned after wars ended, deserters avoiding execution, and criminals who believed the hangman's rope was already waiting. But within this mix of outcasts, certain figures inevitably rose to power. The captain, usually the most cunning or most violent, commanded respect through fear and charisma. His word decided who lived, who died, and how the spoils were divided. Bandit gangs were not chaotic mobs slashing wildly in the dark. Their robberies were planned operations. Some members served as scouts, blending into taverns to listen for rumours about wealthy merchants or nobles on the move. Others specialised in ambush engineering, felling trees without noise, preparing tripwires, or setting up false signals designed to lure travellers into dead ends. A few acted as negotiators during robberies, delivering threats with unnerving calm, while the rest held weapons at the victim's throat. Their codes varied from gang to gang. Some adhered to strict discipline: no unnecessary killing, no harming women, no cheating fellow members. Others embraced total ruthlessness, treating murder as part of the routine. But they all shared a common strategy: striking fast and disappearing faster. The moment a robbery was over, the gang scattered into the forest like smoke. Soldiers who chased them often found only footprints leading into endless woods. Many gangs established hidden camps deep in forests, sometimes reinforced with traps, pits, and makeshift palisades. These encampments were temporary, easily abandoned when heat rose. Some were so cleverly concealed that hunters walked past them, unaware they were a few steps from a dozen armed men. Bandit brotherhoods also forged temporary alliances when a particularly valuable caravan passed through. Rival gangs might join forces to capture royal messengers, silk caravans, or money chests bound for abbeys. Once the loot was shared, often unequally, the alliances dissolved, sometimes violently. To medieval authorities, these gangs were less like criminals and more like guerrilla forces, unpredictable, elusive, and terrifyingly effective. Their cooperation turned isolated robberies into coordinated campaigns of fear, making the bandit brotherhoods of Europe infamous long before their names ever reached a city gate. A medieval highwayman didn't rely solely on brute force. He relied on fear, the invisible weapon that struck victims long before any blade did. Their physical arms were simple, often crude, but devastating in close quarters. Most bandits favoured short swords, hand axes, cudgels, and long knives, weapons easy to conceal, fast to swing, and cheap to replace. Bows were common too, especially among former hunters or soldiers, giving gangs the means to halt travellers from a distance. A single arrow landing in the dirt near a rider's horse was often enough to stop a caravan instantly, but the real danger wasn't what they carried. It was how they used it. Highwaymen excelled at coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm their victims before resistance could form. A common tactic was the roadblock and pincer, where a fallen tree or cart forced travellers to halt while hidden attackers emerged from both sides. Others preferred silent takedowns, tripping a rider with a rope, yanking him off the saddle, and pressing a dagger to his neck before he could scream. Psychological manipulation played an even bigger role. Bandits understood human fear so thoroughly that many of their victims gave up before a weapon was even drawn. Some gangs carved symbols into trees, crude wolf heads, skulls, or slashed crosses, signalling to travellers that they had entered claimed hunting territory. The symbols alone made horses skittish, and pilgrims whisper prayers. Then there were false cries for help. A bandit would lie on the road pretending to be a wounded traveller. When a kind-hearted pilgrim dismounted, rushing to assist, the wounded man whistled sharply, and the gang burst from the underbrush. Medieval chroniclers often lamented that compassion itself became a risk on the open road. Bandits also exploited lighting and sound. Dusk and dawn were ideal times to strike, when long shadows distorted shapes and human eyes struggled to distinguish friend from foe. At night, the thieves used rattling chains or animal calls to confuse their victims, making them think wolves or spirits were nearby. Superstition worked in the bandits' favour. A traveller who believed the forest was haunted was far easier to control. Even after a robbery, the gang's psychological warfare continued. They sometimes released a few victims intentionally, terrified survivors who would carry tales back to nearby towns. Those tales, often exaggerated in panic, served the bandits' purpose. They planted fear on the road long before the bandits themselves arrived. For the highwaymen, mastering fear was as essential as mastering steel. Their weapons wounded, but their tactics conquered. On medieval roads, danger didn't discriminate, but it certainly had preferences. Some travellers were irresistible targets, walking treasure chests wrapped in cloaks and prayers. Others were simply unlucky souls who crossed a bandit's path at the wrong moment. Each class of traveller faced its own particular nightmare. Pilgrims were the easiest prey. They travelled long distances, often on foot, carrying donations, relics, or coins for inns and shrines. Their simple clothing revealed little protection, and their devotion made them predictable. Pilgrims tended to follow established holy routes, and highwaymen mapped those routes with predatory precision. Bandits knew exactly where pilgrims would rest, where they would gather, and at which crossroads they would naturally slow down to pray. Some gangs even disguised themselves as fellow pilgrims, walking alongside their victims for hours before revealing their blades. Merchants faced a different terror. To a bandit, a merchant wagon was a rolling vault. Bales of cloth, barrels of salted fish, sacks of spices, wine, beeswax, leather goods, everything had resale value. Even the animals pulling the carts could be stolen and sold. Merchants often hired guards, but guards could be bribed, outnumbered, or ambushed. Worse, people in marketplaces leaked information carelessly. A single overheard boast about valuable wares headed north could doom an entire caravan. Once marked, merchants became hunted prey long before their wheels ever touched the forest roads. Nobles, despite their wealth, faced a uniquely humiliating danger. A noble caught by highwaymen risked ransom, mockery, and sometimes death. Bandits recognized aristocratic fabrics, jewelry, and signet rings instantly. Some gangs made a sport of stripping nobles of their finery and forcing them to walk home barefoot, their dignity shattered. Others preferred ransom, knowing a baron's family would pay handsomely to retrieve him. But if resistance was shown, or the noble was known for cruelty toward peasants, the bandits' vengeance could be brutal. Yet the most tragic cases were ordinary peasants and travellers who had nothing. Bandits rarely believed a poor man was truly poor. A small pouch of grain or a cheap wooden rosary became hidden treasure in their eyes. Many peasants were robbed of the little they had, a loaf of bread, a wool cloak, even their boots. For them, the robbery wasn't merely frightening, it was life-threatening. Losing supplies meant hunger, freezing nights, or an impossible journey home. On the medieval road, victims didn't just lose money. They lost security, dignity, and sometimes the very faith that had sent them travelling in the first place. For all their cunning and brutality, highwaymen were not unchallenged. Medieval authorities, though often slow and underfunded, eventually struck back. Their response wasn't a single unified system. It was a patchwork of sheriffs, town militias, mounted patrols, and, in desperate times, hired mercenaries who hunted bandits for coin. Each force brought its own methods, limitations, and flaws. Sheriffs and bailiffs were usually the first line of defence. Their responsibility extended beyond towns into the surrounding countryside, but their power stretched thin. A sheriff could issue warrants, raise a posse, or follow a trail of tracks into the woods. But most lacked the manpower to chase organised gangs across miles of wilderness. Many sheriffs were older men, more experienced in tax collection than combat. Still, they understood the political pressure. Travellers demanded safer roads, merchants threatened to avoid certain regions, and nobles complained loudly when ransomed. So the sheriff rode out, knowing full well the bandits he sought might outnumber his men 3-1. Town and village militias added muscle when danger grew too bold. These were not professional soldiers, but blacksmiths, farmers, carpenters and apprentices armed with spears or wood axes. When caravans went missing or a gang terrorised a popular route, the local lord summoned his people to clean the roads. The results varied. Sometimes the militia caught the thieves off guard, overwhelming them with sheer numbers. Other times the bandits melted into the forest before the militia even arrived. The villagers returned home tired, frustrated, and often mocked for failing to stop ghosts. Then there were the mercenary hunters, the most dangerous enemy bandits could face. Kings, wealthy merchants, and powerful abbeys hired these men during periods of extreme banditry. Many were hardened veterans from recent wars, comfortable in chainmail and skilled with bow and blade. Unlike sheriffs, they weren't bound by legal niceties. Their orders were simple: track the gang, corner them, and make an example. Some mercenaries returned to towns with severed bandit heads on their saddles to collect payment. Their presence terrified highwaymen, forcing many gangs to scatter, relocate, or turn against one another in paranoia. But despite these efforts, the authorities always faced one crippling disadvantage. The bandits chose when and where to fight. Forests, valleys, and abandoned ruins favoured ambushers, not uniformed patrols. And corruption complicated everything. Some sheriffs accepted bribes, some nobles secretly employed bandits, and some mercenaries became bandits themselves after their contracts ended. The battle for the roads was never won permanently. Every time authorities pushed back, the bandits retreated, regrouped, and returned, proving that in medieval Europe, order and law were always temporary visitors. When medieval authorities finally caught a highwayman, justice did not arrive quietly. It arrived loudly, publicly, and theatrically, because punishment wasn't only about retribution. It was about sending a message to every traveller, every would-be bandit, and every frightened village. This is what happens to wolves of the road. The execution ground became a stage, and the condemned man the warning sign. Hangings were the most common fate. bandits were often executed at crossroads, city gates, or atop small hills visible from the main roads. These weren't chosen randomly. Travellers were meant to see the bodies swinging in the wind. Chroniclers describe lines of corpses left until they rotted, their bones clacking together like grisly wind chimes. It was crude psychological warfare aimed at discouraging future criminals, but to some hardened bandits, a hanging corpse simply proved the risk of the profession, not a deterrent. Gibbets made the spectacle even more terrifying. A gibbet was an iron cage where a bandit's dead, or sometimes barely living body, was placed and left to decay. Crows circled above, feeding on the remains, while people whispered the thief's story to one another. A gibbet could remain for years, rusting beside a road, reminding generations of travellers of crimes long extinguished. Children grew up staring at the cage, told that the road wolves ended their lives inside it. For especially violent gangs, authorities reserved harsher punishments. Dismemberment, branding, or breaking on the wheel were used to communicate that this particular criminal had done more than steal. He had violated order so severely that his death needed to be memorable. Branding a surviving bandit's cheek or forehead marked him permanently, ensuring no village or tavern would ever welcome him again. These branded men often returned to the forests, joining new gangs out of necessity, feeding the very cycle authorities tried to stop. Yet justice wasn't always pure. False accusations were common. A traveller found with a dagger and a purse of coins could be mistaken for a robber, especially if no one spoke for him. Some lords executed peasants merely to prove they were enforcing the law, and corruption ran deep. A wealthy bandit could bribe his way to freedom, while a desperate beggar might hang for stealing a loaf. Despite the brutality, medieval justice never fully conquered road crime. For every body suspended at a crossroads, 2 more outlaws seemed to take up the fallen man's path. Public punishment created fear, but it also forged legends, turning common criminals into grim folk heroes, whispered about long after their bones were dust. Not every highwayman vanished into an unmarked grave or rotted in a gibbet. Some escaped the ropes of justice not by cunning or steel alone, but through transformation, from criminal to legend. Medieval Europe loved stories, and the darker the figure, the brighter his myth became. Across villages and taverns, ballads turned thieves into rebels, murderers into avengers, and road wolves into folk heroes whose deeds were exaggerated with every retelling. Robin Hood is the most famous example, though his true origin is buried in fragments of outlaw ballads and medieval court records. Whether he was a single man or a collection of tales tied together, his legend thrived because it offered something the common people craved: a hero who robbed the rich, mocked corrupt sheriffs, and protected the weak. In an age where authority was often cruel and justice was unequal, people wanted to believe such a man existed. And so they did. But Robin Hood was far from alone. In Germany, the Schwarzer Hans stories told of a highwayman who targeted cruel lords and spared poor travellers. In France, ballads celebrated Guillaume le Loup, the wolf of the Ardennes, said to move through forests with supernatural silence. In Eastern Europe, tales of outlaws like Fekete Pal painted them as romantic rebels resisting tyrannical nobles. None of these men were saints, most were hardened killers. Yet their legends softened them, stripping away brutality and replacing it with righteousness. What fueled these transformations? Resentment. Peasants and townsfolk were crushed by taxes, tithes, and hungry winters. Bandit stories gave them a fantasy of justice, someone striking back against the powerful. Even clergy contributed to the myth-making. A priest might condemn outlaws from the pulpit, but he couldn't stop parishioners from whispering admiration around hearths at night. Some legends grew because bandits themselves manipulated their image. Outlaws who spared certain travellers or shared a fraction of their loot earned reputations as noble thieves. Others cultivated fear, spreading rumours that they commanded spirits, wolves, or forest demons. Fear kept victims obedient, or kept informants silent. Ironically, the harsher authorities punished highwaymen, the stronger their legends grew. A bandit hanged at a crossroads became a symbol, either of justice or of rebellion. Stories embellished his final moments. How bravely he stood, how boldly he cursed a corrupt sheriff, how he smiled as the noose tightened. In the medieval imagination, the outlaw lived twice, once as a man and forever as a myth, reminding the people that even in an age of kings, the forests still belonged to the wolves. By the late Middle Ages, kings built stronger governments, roads improved, and patrols became more organised. Yet even as Europe marched slowly towards stability, one truth remained unchanged. The wolves of the road never fully disappeared. They simply evolved, adapted, or retreated into new corners of society. Banditry wasn't just a criminal profession. It was a symptom of a world where poverty, war, corruption, and isolation constantly collided. Consider the root of the problem. Medieval life was fragile. A failed harvest, a brutal lord, unpaid soldiers after a war. Any disaster could turn ordinary men into outlaws. A ploughman who couldn't feed his family had two bleak choices: starve or steal. A veteran dismissed without pay after a campaign might find himself wandering with nothing but his sword. Men like these didn't become bandits out of ambition. They became bandits out of necessity. And necessity is difficult to outlaw. Even when authorities built better roads or outlawed taverns that harboured thieves, bandits adapted. They shifted routes, changed tactics, and learned to strike at night or in smaller groups. Many blended into the societies around them, taking up work as porters, labourers, or guards by day, while quietly coordinating robberies by night. The boundary between criminal and civilian was thin, and authorities often learned this too late. The very landscape sustained the problem. Europe was vast. Dense forests, abandoned ruins, sweeping plains, and endless mountain passes created natural sanctuaries where law struggled to reach. A sheriff might clear one valley of thieves, only for the same gang to reappear 15 miles away, unharmed and emboldened. No matter how many were hanged, beaten, or hunted down by mercenaries, the roads always produced more. There was also the economic truth. Banditry paid well. A single successful robbery could earn more than a month's honest work. Capturing a noble might bring in a ransom worth a year's wages. The temptation was immense, especially for men who believed their lives would never improve. And ironically, the legends didn't help. Ballads about noble thieves, stories of clever outlaws outwitting greedy lords, these tales romanticized the life, attracting new recruits who believed they too could become local heroes rather than corpses swinging at a crossroads. So the wolves endured. Maybe fewer, maybe quieter, but still present in the shadows, reminding everyone that even as Europe changed, the fear of the road remained. In every dark forest, in every narrow pass, the traveller's old question survived the centuries. Who waits for me beyond the bend? Marco Polo's journey began not as a heroic quest, nor as a spiritual pilgrimage, but as something far more practical, the business trip of a lifetime. In the 13th century, merchants were the only Europeans who routinely stepped beyond familiar borders, navigating continents with little more than instinct, coin, and courage. Marco grew up in Venice, a city buzzing with sailors, spices, silk, foreign accents, and whispered tales of kingdoms beyond imagination. Yet even in such a crossroads of cultures, nothing could prepare him for what he would encounter once he left the comfort of the Adriatic. His travels would not only record landscapes and wealth, but also reveal how different societies understood desire, hospitality, and human relationships. From the moment Marco, his father Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo crossed into the eastern Mediterranean, he stepped into a world where customs shifted like desert light. In Venice, marriage was a contract between families and wealth, carefully negotiated and bound by church law. But the further east he travelled, the more he saw traditions that challenged everything he thought he understood. Among Persians, hospitality itself was a ritual, a sacred duty rooted in ancient codes of honour. A guest was to be fed, protected, and respected, even if he was a stranger. And sometimes this hospitality extended into the realm of relationships, with hosts offering comforts and companionship in ways that shocked Western sensibilities. In Armenia and Persia, Marco observed social structures where marriage was both rigid and flexible. He saw arranged unions shaped by clan loyalty, but also looser customs like temporary marriages, a concept completely foreign to Latin Europe. He wrote of households where multiple wives or concubines were signs of status, not scandal. For a Venetian raised under strict Christian moral codes, this world was mesmerizing, unsettling, and irresistible to describe. As he moved deeper into Central Asia, crossing barren steppes and bustling caravanserai, Marco encountered Mongol and Turkic traditions that blurred the line between family and duty, affection and alliance. Women in nomadic societies often held far more autonomy than their counterparts in Europe. They managed herds, negotiated exchanges, and participated openly in social life. These roles shaped relationships in ways Venice would find unthinkable. For Marco, the journey across Persia was the first awakening, the realization that love, marriage, and desire were not universal concepts, but cultural expressions. And as he pushed farther toward the court of the Great Khan, he sensed that the most astonishing revelations still lay ahead. By the time Marco Polo crossed into Persia, he realized he had entered a world where hospitality was not a polite courtesy. It was a cultural performance, a sacred obligation, and sometimes a dangerous temptation. Persian hosts believed a traveller carried not only dust and fatigue, but also divine favour. To welcome a guest was to honour God. To mistreat one was to invite shame. And Marco, a foreign merchant from a distant sea city, often found himself treated with an elegance that Venice reserved only for nobles. Persian hospitality began the moment a traveller approached a home or caravanserai. Marco described ornate carpets rolled out for guests, bowls of cool water for washing hands, and platters of pomegranates, dates, lamb, and fragrant rice. But the generosity went beyond food. A guest was shielded from enemies, trusted with family secrets, and sometimes offered an intimacy that left Westerners bewildered. In certain regions, a host might provide a daughter, a servant, or a companion to ensure the traveller never spent the night alone. To refuse such hospitality could be seen as an insult. Marco never directly confesses participation. He was too diplomatic and too aware that his book would be read by Europeans. But he hints. He writes of great kindnesses, of hosts who did all that was fitting, and of women who showed much honour to guests. Readers in Venice could interpret these lines however they wished. Those familiar with Eastern customs understood perfectly. Marriage in Persia added another layer of complexity. Families arranged unions with meticulous care, negotiating dowries, property, and clan alliances. Yet, paradoxically, temporary marriages existed alongside permanent ones. These short-term unions, lasting days or months, were considered lawful and respectable in certain regions. To Venetian eyes, this was shocking. To Persians, it was simply practicality shaped by centuries of tradition. Concubinage, too, was common. Wealthy men kept concubines not merely for pleasure, but to expand their households, secure heirs, and strengthen alliances. Women in these roles often held significant influence within the home, something Marco observed with fascination. They were not prisoners. Many were skilled in music, poetry, negotiation, and household management. As Marco moved from village to village, hosted by merchants, nobles, and caravan leaders, he learned that relationships in Persia were fluid, layered, and deeply tied to concepts of honour and hospitality. A guest was not simply fed. He was absorbed into the rhythm of the household, and Marco, ever the curious observer, recorded it all with a mixture of awe, restraint, and intrigued ambiguity. Persia showed him that hospitality could be sensual, political, and profoundly human, and it prepared him for the even stranger customs that awaited along the Silk Road. For Marco Polo, Persia was only the beginning. As he and his family moved deeper along the Silk Road, the world around him transformed into a living artery. Caravans stretching for miles, camels groaning beneath mountain winds, and travellers from every culture sharing food, gossip, and desire under the same roof. This roof was the caravanserai, the great crossroads of Asia, where relationships were forged not through bloodlines, but through shared danger and survival. A caravanserai wasn't just an inn, it was a universe. Travellers from China, India, Arabia, Armenia, and Central Asia slept side by side in vast stone courtyards built like fortresses. Marco described them as large enclosures with strong gates, and those gates mattered. Once they closed at dusk, no one entered, no one left. Inside, the night became a swirl of humanity, merchants bargaining late into the dark, cooks roasting meat over open fires, musicians plucking foreign instruments, and storytellers spinning tales of deserts, demons, storms, and silk. Relationships here were shaped by necessity. The road was too dangerous to travel alone, so temporary brotherhoods formed. A Persian horse trader might team up with a Chinese silk merchant for protection. An Armenian pilgrim might join a Mongol caravan for safe passage. Marco learned quickly that alliances shifted constantly. Today's protector could become tomorrow's rival. Yet each night, these alliances were reinforced through rituals, sharing bread, exchanging news, and engaging in the subtle dance of trust. Caravanserai life also carried an undercurrent of intimacy. Strangers thrown together often sought comfort in companionship. Women travelling with caravans for trade or service played crucial roles in maintaining the social life of the journey. Some were entertainers or musicians, others were servants who brought warmth to cold desert nights. Marco hints gently, never explicitly, at these encounters. He writes of women skilled in pleasing conversation, of dances of the night, and of travellers who took solace from the hardships of the road. In a culture where loneliness meant vulnerability, such relationships were both emotional refuge and practical alliance. The economic world of the caravanserai was equally layered. Deals were made over wine, tea, or fermented mare's milk. Dowries, marriage arrangements, and informal betrothals sometimes emerged from these trading circles. A merchant might offer his daughter in marriage to seal a partnership, or two families might agree to future unions as part of a business pact. Through these encounters, Marco discovered that the Silk Road wasn't only a highway for goods, it was a highway for relationships. Friendships, romances, rivalries, and alliances flowed through its caravanserais as richly as silks and spices. In this melting world, Marco began to understand the interconnectedness of Eurasia, a place where human bonds mattered as much as trade routes, and where every night held the possibility of a new companion, a new story, or a new danger. Crossing from Persia into the vast steppes of Central Asia, Marco Polo entered a society that overturned almost every assumption a 13th century Venetian held about gender, marriage, and relationships. In Venice, women lived largely in domestic seclusion, bound by dowries, church law, and the constant watch of male relatives. But on the steppe, in the lands of the Turks, Uyghurs, and early Mongol tribes, Marco found a world where women moved with a freedom that startled European sensibilities. They rode horses, commanded households, negotiated prices, and sometimes even influenced tribal politics. Marriage among nomadic peoples was less rigid and more pragmatic. Families arranged unions, yes, but these marriages were fluid, shaped by survival and alliances rather than strict theological rules. Among Turkic groups, a bride brought not only beauty, but labour, horses, and connections. A skilled horsewoman who could herd, fight, or manage livestock was valued as much as, if not more than, her physical attributes. Marco describes steppe women with admiration, strong, confident, and unafraid to speak publicly, an image impossible to imagine in the patrician courts of Venice. Polygamy was accepted, especially for chiefs and wealthy herders. A man with multiple wives wasn't seen as indulgent but capable, able to support large households with food, tents, herds, and protection. In turn, wives often managed distinct camps within the family, giving them authority over servants, children, and resources. Marco observed that these women wielded real power, not symbolic influence. They decided how food was distributed, how herds were organized, and how guests were treated, and guests were essential. Hospitality in the steppe was sacred. Any traveller, even a stranger, was offered shelter, food, and protection. A guest became part of the family for as long as he remained under the roof. In some tribes, a guest was expected to join communal rituals, singing, storytelling, drinking fermented mare's milk, and sharing in nightly gatherings around the fire. These gatherings blurred social boundaries, creating connections that were emotional as much as practical. Marco hints that companionship was sometimes offered to guests, not as scandal or seduction, but as generosity, a way of honouring the visitor and strengthening social ties. Where Venice saw the body as bound by religious rules, the steppe saw it as part of life's natural rhythms. For Marco, Central Asia felt like a world where relationships were honest, direct, and intertwined with survival. Here, marriage wasn't a cage but a partnership. Women were not hidden but visible, and hospitality carried a sensual undertone that foreshadowed the even greater sophistication of the Mongol imperial courts he was about to enter. When Marco Polo finally entered Mongol-controlled territory, he found himself stepping into a political world where relationships were not merely personal choices, they were instruments of governance. The Mongol Empire was the largest land empire in human history, and its rulers understood that marriage, lineage, and intimate alliances held as much power as any army of horsemen. Every union, every concubine, every household arrangement served a strategic purpose. At the heart of this system was the Great Khan, whose palace swarmed with attendants, wives, and women of rank. Marco describes these courts with awe, sprawling tent cities adorned with silk hangings, carpets woven with golden thread, and chambers filled with musicians, dancers, and servants. The women of the Khan's household were not passive ornaments. Many were selected from noble families across conquered nations, offered as tribute, forming diplomatic bonds, or secured through alliances that kept rival clans loyal. Concubinage was not seen as immoral. It was a sophisticated system of managing unity across vast ethnic groups. A concubine could raise her status through intelligence, diplomacy, or producing sons. Some commanded entire wings of the palace, overseeing servants, finances, and political petitions. Marco noted that these women were trained in etiquette, music, and conversation, and that they moved through the palace with a serene authority that surprised him. In Venice, such influence would be scandalous. In the Mongol world, it was expected. Marriage among the Mongols themselves followed clear customs. Brides were often chosen to strengthen intertribal relationships, and marriage negotiations included exchanges of animals, silk, and weapons. Women retained notable rights. They could own property, manage herds, and initiate certain legal processes. Their mobility, riding, travelling, and participating in communal work, was unmatched in Western Europe. Marco found Mongol women confident, outspoken, and central to both domestic and political life. Hospitality played a crucial role in this landscape. Marco wrote that guests of the Khan were greeted with lavish banquets, endless cups of fermented mare's milk, and entertainment performed by women trained in dance and song. Some households extended companionship to guests as a gesture of high honour, something difficult for Westerners to write openly about. Marco, cautious yet observant, noted attentions given to him and other travellers, implying moments of intimacy without ever crossing into explicit confession. What impressed him most was how pragmatic, structured, and dignified these relationships were. Far from the moral rigidity of the Catholic West, the Mongol court embraced sensuality, diplomacy, and family alliances as elements of a single political system. To Marco, it was a world where personal relationships and imperial strategy were woven together, delicate as silk and powerful as steel, a world he had never imagined before his journey began. When Marco Polo finally reached Cathay, the lands ruled by the Song remnants in the south and by the Great Khan's Yuan dynasty in the north, he stepped into a world unlike anything he had witnessed in Persia or the steppe. If the Mongols impressed him with power and pragmatism, the Chinese courts astonished him with refinement. Everything in Cathay seemed crafted with intention. The architecture, the poetry, the manners, the perfumes. even the way people walked and spoke. Relationships here were not wild or instinctual like in the steppes. They were choreographed, measured, subtle, and profoundly sensual in their restraint. Chinese marriage customs struck Marco first. Where Venice emphasized dowries and rigid family honor, Cathay emphasized harmony. Marriages were arranged through careful consultations between families, astrologers, and matchmakers. Compatibility mattered. Auspicious birthdays mattered. Even the symbolic balance of yin and yang played a role. A good match wasn't just about wealth. It was about creating a household that flowed in peace. The role of women fascinated Marco. While elite women lived within defined domestic spheres, they were highly educated in poetry, music, calligraphy, and etiquette. Their influence was indirect but powerful. A skilled woman's ability to host, entertain, and counsel her husband elevated the entire household's prestige. Marco admired their grace, their artistry, and the way they appeared to move with effortless composure. Then there were the courtesans, women trained in refined conversation, music, and poetry, who entertained merchants and nobles in tea-houses or private gardens. Unlike concubines in Mongol courts, courtesans in Cathay were cultural performers, serving as symbols of urban sophistication. Marco describes gatherings where courtesans played stringed instruments, recited verses, and exchanged witty banter with guests. Intimacy here was intellectual as much as physical. A meaningful glance or a whispered poem carried more weight than bold displays of affection. Concubinage existed as well, but carried less political weight than in Mongol society. Wealthy men kept concubines to secure lineage, manage households, or simply enjoy companionship. Yet even concubines were expected to master etiquette, poetry, and household arts. Their presence added layers of complexity to family relationships, but the emphasis remained on maintaining internal harmony rather than asserting dominance. Hospitality in Cathay combined sensuality with elegance. A guest might be greeted with incense, warm tea, silken cushions, and soft music played behind latticed screens. Pleasure was not rushed, it unfolded. Marco was struck by how emotional, intellectual, and physical comfort were blended seamlessly, as if the Chinese had perfected not just the art of living, but the art of making a guest feel deeply, almost dangerously, at ease. After the raw power of Mongol life and the rugged freedom of the steppe, Cathay felt like a dream. A world where relationships were polished into art forms, and where desire expressed itself through poetry, ceremony, and the soft rustle of silk. To understand Marco Polo's experiences at the Mongol Chinese court, one must enter the private world behind the silk screens. The women of the Great Khan. Their lives were wrapped in luxury and protocol, yet they wielded influence far beyond what Western chroniclers imagined. Marco's descriptions are cautious, but between the lines he reveals a world where intimacy was political currency, femininity was cultivated like an art, and beauty was both celebrated and regimented. Each year, across the vastness of the empire, officials selected the most accomplished young women to send to the Khan's court. These chosen maidens, as Marco calls them, were evaluated not only for beauty, but for refinement, their skill in singing, playing instruments, pouring wine, reciting poetry, and observing court etiquette. They were not merely companions, they were embodiments of imperial prestige. Families viewed selection as an honor, a chance for their daughter to ascend into the highest circles of power. Once in the palace, life unfolded according to strict rhythms. The young women lived in dedicated quarters where they were taught courtly arts by senior attendants. Marco notes their meticulous grooming, perfumed baths, flowing silk garments, ornate hairstyles adorned with jade and gold. The palace smelled of incense, camphor, and flowers floating in carved basins. But beneath the elegance lay competition. Subtle, silent, and relentless. A favoured woman could rise to significant status, while others lived in quiet obscurity. Marco describes the nightly rituals with a notable mixture of fascination and restraint. When the Khan travelled, often in massive processions of tents, wagons, servants, and guards. A select group of women accompanied him in palatial felt pavilions decorated in silk. Before visiting the Khan, attendants prepared them with oils, perfumes, and fresh robes. The chosen woman was led to the Khan's quarters with ceremony, her presence symbolizing harmony, prosperity, and imperial magnificence. No detail of her appearance or conduct was accidental. What intrigued Marco most was not the sensuality, but the structure. Even the tender aspects of life were regulated by rules that reinforced imperial power. Favoured women received lands, servants, and influence. They could advocate for relatives, negotiate with ministers, and act as intermediaries for those seeking the Khan's favour. Yet Marco also hints at the emotional complexity of this world. These women lived in gilded isolation, pampered yet constrained, influential yet replaceable. Their relationships with the Khan were not simply personal, but woven into the political fabric of the empire. To Marco, the palace women represented a fusion of sensual refinement and imperial authority. Behind their beauty lay a system that married intimacy with power and desire with statecraft, a world he could observe but never fully penetrate. As Marco Polo settled into life at the Mongol and Chinese courts, he found himself in a unique position. A Westerner who was neither outsider nor insider, moving freely between worlds that rarely understood one another. In his writings, he hints at dinners, celebrations, and private gatherings where cultures blended, moments when merchants, nobles, courtesans, scholars, warriors, and entertainers all shared the same space. These encounters formed the emotional core of Marco's relationships abroad, revealing how intimacy and friendship unfolded across borders. Feasts were the first bridge. Marco describes banquets where Mongol roasted meats met Chinese delicacies, where Persian wine accompanied northern mare's milk, and where music blended fiddles, zithers, and drums from 3 continents. The air shimmered with scents: ginger, garlic, incense, roasted lamb, steamed fish, and as food was shared, so too were stories. A Persian merchant might whisper tales of Sufi mystics. A Chinese poet might recite verses about longing and moonlit rivers. A Mongol officer might recount battles fought on frozen lakes. Marco sat among them, absorbing everything, every accent, gesture, proverb, and song. These gatherings weren't only about entertainment. They shaped relationships. Hospitality in the Mongol Empire encouraged emotional openness. Guests were treated as honoured companions, not distant strangers. A man's rank mattered less at night than his ability to drink, converse, and appreciate music. Marco often found that women participated too: musicians, dancers, storytellers, and sometimes companions chosen for their charm and wit. They were not passive ornaments, but active contributors to the social atmosphere, capable of steering conversations with humour or quiet intelligence. Marco never writes explicitly of romantic encounters, but his descriptions shimmer with implication. He notes moments when affections were shown, when a host extended great courtesy, or when ladies skilled in politeness and discourse kept company with travellers. In Venice, such phrasing would be modest. In Asia, such moments were deeply understood. These interactions were cultural exchanges in their own right, windows into emotional worlds shaped by poetry, ritual, and warmth. Friendships across languages also developed. Marco grew close to interpreters, scholars, and officials who admired his curiosity. Some became lifelong companions during his years of service under Kublai Khan. They debated philosophy, traded jokes, exchanged small gifts, and forged a sense of brotherhood impossible to replicate on the dangerous roads of Europe. By living between cultures, Marco experienced a kind of emotional expansion. He learned that hospitality could be sensual, intellectual, or deeply familial, and often all 3 at once. These encounters taught him not only how to travel Asia, but how to belong to it, if only briefly. When Marco Polo finally returned to Venice after more than 2 decades abroad, he came home as a stranger. He was no longer the young merchant who had left the Adriatic. He was a man shaped by deserts, courts, steppe feasts, Chinese gardens, and Mongol diplomacy. Venice, with its stone alleyways and familiar canals, must have felt both comforting and impossibly small. Yet the greatest distance wasn't geographic, it was emotional. Marco carried with him a lifetime of relationships built across cultures, languages, and worlds that his fellow Venetians couldn't imagine. His book, Il Milione, reflects this divide. Venetian scribes wanted marvels, palaces of gold, paper money, giant birds, and invisible trade networks. Marco gave them those. But what he hinted at, carefully, almost shyly, were the human connections he left behind. The friends who guided him through mountain passes. The scholars who debated philosophy with him in Kublai Khan's halls. The entertainers and courtesans whose music eased the loneliness of foreign lands. The women he admired for their grace, strength, or quiet authority. He writes of them indirectly, as if speaking too clearly might betray a promise or break a memory. He describes women of great courtesy, companions in night feasts, maidens skilled in arts, and great favours shown to guests. These passing phrases reveal more than they conceal. Marco was a diplomat. He knew better than to scandalise European audiences with explicit stories. Yet he could not erase the warmth, complexity, and sensual sophistication of the relationships he encountered. Back in Venice, his tales were so extraordinary that many accused him of invention. But what they doubted was not the geography. It was the intimacy. How could a Venetian merchant truly understand the marital diplomacy of the Mongols, the intellectual courtesans of Hangzhou, or the firelit hospitality of Persian homes? How could he speak credibly of a world where women negotiated alliances, where companionship was offered as honour, where relationships were rituals shaped by dynasty, poetry, and empire? And yet, he did. The greatest irony of Marco's life is that the relationships he formed in Asia were more meaningful than many he found at home. His marriage in Venice was respectable, but it lacked the wonder he once knew on the Silk Road. His memories of palace singers, Mongol attendants, Chinese hostesses pouring tea by candlelight, and steppe women riding like queens, likely lingered long after he became Il Milione, the storyteller others doubted. In the end, Marco Polo did not merely record the geography of Asia. He recorded its hearts. And long after he left Cathay, part of him never returned. Mark Antony entered the world in 83 BCE, at a moment when the Roman Republic was already cracking under the weight of its own ambition. Civil wars, political murders, and rival strongmen had turned Rome into a battlefield disguised as a city. Antony's family belonged to the ancient gens Antonia, noble in lineage but ruined in finances. His father died young, leaving behind debts, fading status, and a restless son with more pride than money. The streets became Antony's first school, and Rome's chaos became his first mentor. From an early age, Antony stood out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, athletic, and so naturally charismatic that even seasoned soldiers later remarked how the man could electrify a crowd with a joke or a roar. Yet for all his promise, young Antony nearly destroyed himself before his life even began. He drank too much, gambled too hard, chased women too boldly, and surrounded himself with friends even wilder than he was. Rome whispered that Antony was wasting his talent. Rome was wrong. He was sharpening it. Military service saved him. When Antony fled his debts by joining the cavalry in Syria, he found a world where discipline, danger, and daring finally aligned with his nature. On the battlefield, Antony transformed. The hot-headed youth became a commander who could charge into enemy lines with terrifying confidence. His soldiers adored him. He fought beside them, drank with them, and never pretended to be anything other than what he was, a warrior who lived fast and demanded loyalty at the same pace. But Antony's destiny changed the moment he crossed paths with Julius Caesar. What began as political cooperation quickly evolved into one of the most powerful alliances in Roman history. Caesar recognized Antony's greatest strengths: courage, loyalty, charisma, and an instinctive ability to sway the Roman masses. Where Caesar was calculating and restrained, Antony was fiery and bold. Together, they formed a perfect balance. Intellect and force, strategy and passion, and Antony became Caesar's right hand, his voice in the Senate, his enforcer in the streets, and eventually his co-consul. To many Romans, he was more than a general. He was Caesar's successor in everything but name. The pair marched through war after war, their victories reshaping the Mediterranean. Yet beneath Antony's rise lay a truth that would shape the rest of his life. He was forever drawn toward intensity, in politics, in battle, and especially in love. And Rome, already trembling, had no idea what storm this lion would unleash. Once Mark Antony joined Julius Caesar's inner circle, his life accelerated into a whirlwind of battles, marches, and political warfare. Caesar didn't just see Antony as an ally. He saw him as a weapon, a living hammer. And wherever Caesar struck, Antony was the force that made the blow land harder. During the Gallic Wars, Antony became indispensable. Caesar trusted him with legions, supply lines, negotiations, and the delicate balance of keeping fractious soldiers loyal. Antony had a gift. He could walk into a camp of exhausted, half-starved men, laugh, drink with them, and by sunrise have them ready to march into hell. His presence on the battlefield was explosive. Cloaked in his scarlet general's cape, Antony was known to fight at the front, covered in dust and blood like the lowest recruit. To the Gauls, Germans, and rebels who faced him, he was the fierce Roman giant who seemed impossible to break. But Antony wasn't just a warrior. He was Caesar's voice when Caesar wasn't there. While the general conquered Gaul, Antony kept order in Rome as the master of the horse, essentially the second in command of the Republic. And order in Rome meant suppressing riots, intimidating senators, and outmaneuvering political enemies who wanted Caesar gone. Antony excelled at it. He bullied the Optimates, rallied the Populares, and made it clear that anyone who challenged Caesar would face the wrath of his most loyal soldier. The Senate hated him for it. Cicero, disgusted by Antony's raw energy and intimidating presence, called him a butcher, a gladiator, and a man whose loyalty was both admirable and dangerous. Cicero wasn't entirely wrong. Antony's devotion to Caesar bordered on absolute. He admired Caesar's intellect, respected his ambition, and believed sincerely that Caesar was the man destined to reshape Rome. If Caesar asked him to hold a city, Antony held it. If Caesar asked him to break an enemy, Antony shattered them. And then came the civil war. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Antony rode beside him, sealing both their fates. They had chosen rebellion over submission, destiny over caution. Antony commanded troops at Pharsalus, crushing Pompey's forces. He secured Italy when Caesar pursued Pompey to Egypt. He protected the Republic's grain routes, its armies, its fragile political alliances. By the time Caesar emerged victorious, Antony wasn't merely a general. He was the enforcer of a new order, Caesar's Rome. But victory always brings shadows. And soon, those shadows would swallow them both. By 44 BCE, Mark Antony stood at the height of his power. He was consul alongside Julius Caesar, the second most influential man in Rome, and widely assumed to be Caesar's political heir. But power in Rome always cast a long shadow, and the Senate's fear of Caesar's rising dominance grew darker by the day. The conspirators whispered that Caesar sought to become king. They believed Rome would not survive another strongman. They were wrong. Rome would not survive them. Antony sensed something was wrong in the weeks before the assassination. He heard rumours, felt the tension, saw senators exchange glances that lasted a second too long. He warned Caesar. Caesar, exhausted from years of war, brushed it off. "They cannot kill me," he told Antony, "unless you also wish it." It was a joke, and a prophecy. On the morning of the Ides of March, Caesar prepared to leave for the Senate. Antony tried to accompany him, but Decimus Brutus deliberately separated them. Caesar was urged to hurry. Antony delayed. The conspirators knew that if Antony entered the Senate house with Caesar, none of them would survive. Antony was too strong, too loyal, too unpredictable in battle. They needed him out of the picture. When Caesar walked into the Curia, Antony was kept occupied at the entrance by Trebonius, who engaged him in conversation just long enough for the blades to be drawn. Then, screams, movement, panic, and the wet sound of knives striking flesh. Inside, Caesar fell beneath 23 wounds. Outside, Antony realized what had happened. He fled, not out of cowardice, but out of calculation. If he tried to fight 20 armed senators alone, he would die instantly. If he died, Caesar's cause died with him. So Antony slipped away, disguised himself, and waited for the city's reaction. Fury, confusion, chaos. Brutus and Cassius expected the people to hail them as liberators. Instead, Rome trembled. The Republic had not been saved. It had been thrown into a whirlwind. And everyone waited for one man, Caesar's closest ally, the only surviving pillar of Caesarian power, to speak. Antony attended Caesar's funeral with a face carved from stone. He saw the blood-stained toga, the mutilated body, the hopelessness etched into the crowd. This was no victory. This was an open wound. And Antony, the lion Rome underestimated, was about to make it bleed. When Caesar's body was carried into the Forum, the conspirators believed they had already won. They expected a calm ceremony, a dignified farewell, and a smooth transition back to senatorial control. What they forgot was the one man who could turn a funeral into a revolution. Mark Antony. Antony had prepared carefully. He negotiated with Brutus to speak after the conspirators, allowing them to expose themselves first. Brutus spoke plainly, almost coldly, insisting Caesar died because he was ambitious. His speech earned polite approval, but not passion. Then Antony stepped forward, draped in a blood-stained toga, holding Caesar's will, his expression a masterwork of grief and barely veiled fury. The opening lines were gentle, disarming, delivered in a voice thick with sorrow. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Rome fell silent. Antony claimed he was not there to praise Caesar, only to bury him. But every sentence that followed was a blade. He repeated Brutus's claim that Caesar was ambitious, but each repetition dripped with sharper irony. Was a man ambitious who refused a crown 3 times? Was a tyrant generous enough to fill the treasury with spoils for the people? Antony's speech was not an argument. It was a trap. The crowd wavered. Murmurs grew. Antony pressed harder. And then came the moment Rome never forgot. Antony pulled away the cloak covering Caesar's corpse, revealing the stab wounds one by one. He pointed to each wound, naming the men who inflicted them. The crowd gasped. Mothers wept. Men shouted. And Antony wasn't finished. He read aloud Caesar's will. Caesar had left his gardens to the public, his money to every Roman citizen, his love to the very people watching his butchered body. In a single moment, Antony transformed Caesar from suspected tyrant into martyred father of the Republic. The crowd exploded. Shouts echoed across the Forum. "Burn the houses of the traitors! Caesar has been avenged!" The funeral pyre, meant to be solemn, turned into a riot as citizens tore benches apart to feed the flames. The fire spread into the streets as mobs hunted the conspirators. Antony watched, expression grave, but inside he knew he had achieved exactly what he wanted. The conspirators were now enemies of the people. With one speech, Antony had reshaped Rome's future. He had turned grief into rage, loyalty into vengeance, and a murdered dictator into a rallying cry. The civil wars had begun, and Antony lit the first spark. In the aftermath of Caesar's funeral, Rome spiraled into a storm of assassins, mobs, and desperate power grabs. And standing at the centre was Mark Antony, the man who had just turned the Republic upside down with a single speech. But even Antony could not rule Rome alone. The conspirators had fled east, armies were forming, senators were panicking. And in the shadows stood a quiet, calculating 20-year-old with Caesar's name and bloodline, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus. At first, Antony underestimated him. Everyone did. Octavian looked fragile, scholarly, too young to lead. But he had Caesar's inheritance, Caesar's loyal veterans, and Caesar's genius for propaganda. Rome began to divide. Some backed Antony, the heir in spirit, others backed Octavian, the heir in law. The Republic trembled again. Yet neither man could defeat Brutus and Cassius alone. So in 43 BCE, on a cold patch of ground near Bononia, Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus met and carved the Roman world into 3 parts. This was not a polite agreement. It was a cold-blooded pact, sealed with mutual distrust. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned dictatorship over the Roman state. Their first act? A massive purge. They drew up lists of enemies, hundreds of senators, thousands of equestrians, who were to be executed or exiled. Cicero, Antony's most vocal enemy, appeared on Antony's list. Octavian allowed it. Cicero was hunted down and killed, his hands and head nailed to the rostra, as Antony's brutal message to Rome: "This is the price of crossing me." With their home front secured, the triumvirs marched east to face Brutus and Cassius. Antony commanded the left wing at Philippi, where he fought like the soldier he had always been, in the dust, shouting orders, rallying troops personally. Octavian, sick and inexperienced, stayed in his tent. But Antony's victory became their victory, and together they crushed the last hope of the old republic. Brutus and Cassius fell on their swords. Liberty died with them. After Philippi, the triumvirate divided the spoils again. Lepidus was pushed aside like a servant. Octavian claimed the west, and Antony took the east, the wealthier, older, culturally richer half of Rome's empire. It was a prize worthy of a conqueror. But the east held more than riches. It held Cleopatra. And Antony, fresh from triumph, was about to meet the queen who would reshape his destiny and destroy everything he had built. When Mark Antony sailed into Tarsus in 41 BCE, fresh from victory at Philippi, he expected to meet a client queen who owed Rome loyalty. Instead, he met a force of nature. Cleopatra VII, last ruler of the Ptolemies, entered the city like a goddess returning to her temple. Plutarch describes her barge gliding down the Cydnus River with purple sails, silver oars, and attendants dressed as cupids. Perfume drifted across the water. Music floated over the breeze. And at the centre stood Cleopatra, poised, radiant, and calculating. Antony, the conqueror of Brutus and Cassius, the terror of Rome's enemies, was stunned. Cleopatra did not grovel before Rome's new master. She studied him, admired him, challenged him. The queen understood something few did. Antony lived not only for power but for spectacle, for admiration, for emotional intensity. She offered all 3. Their first conversation was a duel of charisma. Antony boasted of his victories. Cleopatra countered with tales of her lineage, her studies, and her command of languages, 9 in total. Antony laughed loudly. Cleopatra responded with wit sharp enough to draw blood. He invited her to dine with him. She declined, and invited him to her banquet instead. That night, Antony entered a world unlike anything in Rome. Gold cups, jewelled couches, dancers, poets, and musicians filled Cleopatra's palace tent. Antony, accustomed to Roman austerity and military camps, stepped into an atmosphere of cultivated luxury, one designed specifically to disarm, impress, and enchant. Cleopatra didn't simply seduce Antony physically. She seduced his sense of destiny. She made him feel like more than Caesar's heir. She made him feel like a king. Their romance ignited instantly. Antony spent the winter in Alexandria, abandoning political duties as he joined Cleopatra in feasts, hunts, fishing games, philosophical debates, and nights of wine-soaked revelry. Their group of companions formed the infamous Inimitable Livers, a society devoted to pleasure, laughter, and extravagant living. For Antony, it was intoxicating. For his enemies in Rome, it was scandal. Cleopatra understood the stakes better than Antony did. She needed Antony's protection against rivals and against Rome itself. Antony, meanwhile, saw in Cleopatra a partner who matched his intensity, his ambition, and his desire to carve out a new empire in the East. But Rome was watching. To the senators and citizens, Antony was no longer the lion of Caesar's legacy. He was a man bewitched, corrupted, transformed by an Egyptian queen. And Octavian, quiet and patient, was preparing to use this perception like a knife. Antony had found love, power, and purpose in Cleopatra. He had also found the beginning of his downfall. While Mark Antony indulged in the splendour of Alexandria and the intoxicating world Cleopatra built around him, Octavian was transforming himself into Rome's saviour. What Antony saw as a temporary escape, his rival saw as a golden opportunity. Every feast in Alexandria, every rumour of luxury, every whispered story of Egyptian influence became ammunition. Antony thought he was secure. Octavian knew he was vulnerable. The triumvirate was already dying. Lepidus had been brushed aside, his power stripped after a failed rebellion. Rome now had only 2 giants left, and the city could not contain them both. Octavian controlled the west, the heartland of Roman identity. Antony controlled the east, the wealthy engine of the empire. Cooperation was impossible. Suspicion grew heavy as storm clouds. Then came the spark. Antony divorced Octavia. Octavia was Octavian's sister, dignified, intelligent, and beloved by Rome. Antony married her to maintain peace between the 2 halves of the empire. But Cleopatra was no ordinary lover. She was queen, partner, strategist. Antony returned to Egypt and renounced his Roman wife, giving Octavian exactly what he needed. Overnight, Antony became the villain of Roman gossip, the general who abandoned his wife, the Roman who preferred the East to the Republic, the man who let a foreign queen guide his decisions. Octavian twisted the knife deeper. He seized Antony's will, or claimed to, and read it aloud to the Senate. Whether forged or real, it was devastating. The will allegedly stated that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, that he had given territories to Cleopatra's children, that he saw himself not as a Roman leader, but as an Eastern monarch. Rome's senators gasped. Its people raged. To them, Antony was no longer Caesar's heir. He was an enemy. Antony tried to counter the narrative. He made alliances, secured troops, and issued proclamations defending his loyalty. But Octavian controlled the capital, the Senate, the veterans, and most importantly, the message. He framed the coming war not as Rome versus Antony, but Rome versus Cleopatra, Egypt versus the Republic, civilization versus corruption. Antony suddenly found himself leading an empire that distrusted him against an empire that adored Octavian. The triumvirate had collapsed. The Republic was dead in everything but name, and the final conflict of Rome was no longer about politics. It was personal. Antony and Octavian were on a collision course, and only one Rome would survive them. By 32 BCE, the rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian had transformed into a full-scale existential crisis for Rome. Their propaganda war erupted into open conflict, and both sides mobilized everything they controlled: legions, fleets, allies, and the hopes of millions. Yet from the moment Antony and Cleopatra sailed their combined forces into the Ionian Sea, destiny tilted against them. Antony had the larger fleet. He had the more experienced soldiers. He had the wealth of the East behind him. But Octavian had something far more lethal. Agrippa, the greatest naval commander of the age. Agrippa seized strategic islands, cut Antony's supply lines, and forced him into a defensive position at Actium, a windy harbour on the western coast of Greece. Antony found himself trapped, unable to retreat, unable to advance and slowly starving. Morale decayed. Disease spread through the camps. Desertions increased daily. Roman officers whispered that Cleopatra should never have been brought along. Her presence fed Octavian's propaganda that the war was foreign, un-Roman, corrupt. Antony insisted she stay. He trusted her counsel, needed her fleet, and could not imagine abandoning the woman who had become his partner in rule and in life. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, the fleets clashed. Actium was not a glorious battle. It was a slow, grinding catastrophe. Antony's ships were heavy, strong, and packed with soldiers, but Agrippa outmaneuvered them with lighter, faster vessels. As Roman arrows darkened the sky and ships locked in screaming impact, Cleopatra made a sudden, desperate gamble. Her squadron broke through the melee and fled south toward Egypt. Antony saw her sails, the distinctive purple banners of the Ptolemies, disappearing into the horizon. In that instant, everything changed. Antony abandoned the battle. He broke formation, turned his ship, and followed Cleopatra. To his soldiers, it was betrayal. To his enemies, it was proof of corruption. To Antony himself, it was a decision born of love, despair, and the crushing realization that the war was lost. Actium annihilated his political authority. Legions surrendered. Allies defected. The eastern provinces declared for Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, their world collapsing behind them like a dying star. In the months that followed, Antony's Roman identity crumbled. He drank heavily, withdrew from command, and watched Octavian tighten the noose around Egypt. Yet even then, he refused to surrender. The lion was wounded, bleeding, abandoned by fate, but not broken. Actium was not the end. It was the beginning of Antony's final tragic stand. After the disaster at Actium, Mark Antony retreated to Alexandria with Cleopatra, clinging to the last remnants of their power. But the world they once commanded was dissolving. One by one, Roman governors defected to Octavian. Grain shipments stopped. Legions surrendered. Even old allies sent word that the game was over. Alexandria became a gilded trap, the final stage on which Antony's tragedy would unfold. Antony tried to rally what remained of his forces, but he was not the commander he once was. His spirit was shattered. He drank heavily, secluded himself, and watched as Octavian's forces tightened around Egypt like an iron ring. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, prepared for the worst, using her fleet to negotiate, hiding treasures and attempting last-minute diplomacy. Antony saw these frantic preparations and mistook them for betrayal. Then came Octavian's final push. In 30 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony attempted one last stand with the few soldiers still loyal to him, but even these were outmatched. When Cleopatra's ships surrendered, some say without a fight, Antony believed the woman he loved had betrayed him. News reached him that Cleopatra had taken refuge in her mausoleum, and according to the rumour Octavian's agents deliberately spread, had already taken her life to avoid capture. Antony broke. Believing Cleopatra dead, he did what every Roman general of his generation considered the only honourable ending. He chose his own death. He stabbed himself in the stomach, but the wound was not immediately fatal. As he lay bleeding, another message arrived. Cleopatra was alive. Summoning his remaining strength, Antony demanded to be taken to her. Too weak to walk, he was lifted by servants and carried through the streets of Alexandria. Cleopatra, refusing to let Octavian capture her lover, had barricaded herself inside her mausoleum. The doors could not be opened. So Antony was hoisted through a window, bloodied, dying, but still conscious enough to see her face one last time. In that dim, perfumed chamber of stone and gold, Antony died in Cleopatra's arms. His final words, recorded by Plutarch, were simple. Do not sorrow. Make your peace with Caesar. Live. Cleopatra did not listen. Days later, after meeting Octavian and realizing she would be paraded as a trophy in Rome, she chose her own death, famously through the bite of a venomous asp, though historians still debate the method. With Antony and Cleopatra dead, Octavian claimed Egypt, defeated all rivals, and became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Thus ended the Republic, and thus ended Mark Antony, the Lion of Rome, undone by loyalty, ambition, and love.